Hey there! Tonight we step into the golden sandals of ancient Egypt's most powerful figures, the pharaohs. When most people imagine life as an Egyptian ruler, they picture unlimited wealth, magnificent palaces, servants attending to every need, and absolute power stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the depths of Nubia. The reality, however, was far more complicated and often deeply uncomfortable than those glittering images suggest. Before settling in, take a moment to like this exploration if it interests you, and perhaps share in the comments where you're tuning in from around the world. It's always wonderful to connect with fellow history enthusiasts. Now get comfortable, and let's journey together through the surprisingly difficult world of ancient Egyptian royalty. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt ruled for over 3,000 years, guiding one of history's most remarkable civilizations through periods of prosperity, crisis, invasion, and renewal. These rulers commissioned monuments that still inspire wonder today, commanded armies that expanded Egypt's borders, and presided over a culture that produced art, literature, and innovations that influenced the ancient world profoundly. Yet behind the magnificent facade of power and divinity lay a reality filled with crushing responsibilities, impossible expectations, constant dangers, exhausting rituals, and a life so controlled and scrutinized that personal freedom became almost non-existent. Being pharaoh meant carrying the weight of an entire civilization on your shoulders while maintaining the appearance of effortless divine authority every moment of every day. Understanding why ruling ancient Egypt was so unbearable requires examining multiple dimensions of royal life. The religious burdens that never lifted, the political dangers lurking in every shadow, the physical discomforts of royal regalia and cosmetics, the isolation from normal human experience, the family conflicts that could turn deadly, and the relentless ceremonial obligations that consume nearly every waking hour. Tonight's exploration examines the hidden difficulties behind the throne, revealing how the life of absolute power came with a cost that few modern people would willingly pay. So let's begin where any understanding of Egyptian kingship must start, with the impossible burden of being considered a living god. From the moment a pharaoh took the throne, they ceased being merely human in the eyes of their subjects. They became a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, and the intermediary between the divine realm and mortal Egypt. This transformation sounds magnificent until you consider what it actually meant for the person wearing the crown. Every action, every word, every gesture carried divine significance. A pharaoh couldn't simply have a bad day or show weakness. They couldn't admit uncertainty, express fear, or display the normal range of human emotions that everyone else took for granted. The moment they appeared before their subjects, they had to embody perfection, wisdom, and divine authority regardless of how they actually felt inside. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that thousands of people believed your mood could affect whether the Nile flooded properly that year. If the river rose too high or too low, causing famine, people might whisper that the pharaoh had somehow displeased the gods. The agricultural prosperity of an entire nation rested in the public imagination on the pharaoh's ability to maintain cosmic order. This concept of cosmic order, called Mahat, represented balance, justice, and harmony in the universe. The pharaoh served as guardian of Mahat, personally responsible for maintaining the delicate equilibrium between chaos and order. Every natural disaster, every crop failure, every military defeat could be interpreted as the pharaoh's failure to uphold Ma'at. Talk about pressure. The divine status meant that pharaohs couldn't form normal relationships. Everyone who approached them did so with the understanding that they were in the presence of divinity. Genuine friendship became nearly impossible when everyone who spoke to you was simultaneously worshipping you. The loneliness of constantly being treated as something other than human created profound isolation. Even within their own families, pharaohs occupied separate spheres. Their children were raised to venerate them as gods. Their spouses, while often powerful in their own right, still maintained the formal protocols of addressing divinity. The simple human connection of being seen as a flawed, struggling person by loved ones was largely denied to pharaohs. The religious expectations extended to the pharaoh's physical person. They were expected to maintain ritual purity through constant bathing, specific diets, and various cleansing ceremonies. The pharaoh's body wasn't entirely their own, but belonged to Egypt and the gods. Every aspect of personal care carried religious significance, and required proper ritual observance. The pressure to produce an heir added another layer of divine expectation. A pharaoh who failed to father children, particularly sons, faced the nightmare of succession crisis. The dynasty's continuation depended on producing legitimate offspring who could maintain the divine bloodline. This transformed the intimate aspects of life into matters of state concern and religious obligation. The divine status also meant that a pharaoh's death required elaborate preparations to ensure their successful journey to the afterlife and transformation into an eternal god. Even the prospect of death became a massive religious and political undertaking requiring years of preparation, the construction of massive tombs, and the gathering of wealth to ensure proper burial. The contradiction of being human yet treated as divine created psychological tensions that must have been exhausting. Pharaohs experienced hunger, pain, illness, fear, and all the vulnerabilities of mortal existence, yet they had to hide these realities behind a mask of divine perfection. The gap between inner reality and outer performance never closed. Young pharaohs who inherited the throne as children faced particularly difficult adjustments. Imagine being 10 years old, and suddenly everyone around you prostrates themselves, addresses you with divine titles, and expects you to make decisions affecting millions of people. The loss of normal childhood under such circumstances must have been traumatic. Even elderly pharaohs couldn't retire or step away from divine responsibilities. There was no pension planned for pharaohs, no comfortable retirement where they could finally relax and just be human. They remained divine until death, maintaining the performance until their final breath. The divine status also made it nearly impossible to admit mistakes or change course. Gods didn't make errors, so pharaohs couldn't easily acknowledge when policies failed or decisions proved wrong. This inflexibility, required by the divine image, sometimes prevented practical solutions to problems, because admitting the need for change implied previous imperfection. Religious texts and temple inscriptions constantly reinforced the pharaoh's divine nature, creating public expectations that were impossible to meet. The pharaoh was described as all-knowing, all-powerful, beloved by all gods, and capable of superhuman feats. Living up to such descriptions in reality proved impossible, creating constant tension between myth and reality. The burden of divine status never lifted, never lightened. From coronation to death, pharaohs carried this weight, performing divinity while privately experiencing all the doubts, pains, and fears that make us human. It was, quite simply, an unbearable way to live. Beyond simply being divine, pharaohs had to prove their divine nature daily through an exhausting schedule of religious ceremonies, rituals, and obligations that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. The ceremonial calendar that governed royal life would make even the busiest modern executive grateful for their comparatively simple schedule. The day began before dawn with the morning ritual of opening the temple. The pharaoh, or a high priest acting in their name, had to perform ceremonies awakening the gods in their temple sanctuaries. This involved precise sequences of prayers, offerings, and ritual actions that couldn't be shortened or simplified. Getting the ritual wrong risked angering the gods and bringing misfortune to Egypt. These morning ceremonies alone could take hours. The pharaoh would need to ritually purify themselves, don specific ceremonial clothing, recite lengthy prayers in precise order, make offerings of food and incense, and perform various symbolic actions representing cosmic renewal. And this was just the start of the day. Throughout the day, additional ceremonies marked important moments. Noon rituals honoured Ra at his zenith. Evening ceremonies put the gods to rest for the night. Major temples across Egypt required royal attention, and while the pharaoh couldn't personally attend every temple daily, they remained ultimately responsible for all religious observances throughout the kingdom. The religious calendar included countless festivals throughout the year, each requiring royal participation or sponsorship. The Opet festival, Sed festival, various gods' feast days, astronomical celebrations and seasonal observances filled the calendar. Missing these festivals or performing them inadequately could be interpreted as neglecting religious duties. The Opet festival alone required the pharaoh to participate in a massive public procession from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, approximately 2 miles away. This wasn't a simple walk, but an elaborate ceremony involving carrying sacred bark boats containing divine images, performing rituals at numerous stations along the route, and maintaining divine bearing throughout. The festival lasted several weeks and demanded constant royal involvement. The said festival, typically celebrated after 30 years of rule, and then repeatedly afterward, involved elaborate ceremonies meant to magically rejuvenate the pharaoh and renew their divine power. This multi-day festival required the pharaoh to perform athletic feats, visit sacred sites, wear countless different ceremonial costumes, and participate in rituals that were physically exhausting, even for young, healthy rulers. Every temple construction, statue dedication, or religious monument required ceremonial participation by the pharaoh. The blessing of new temples, the dedication of obelisks, the installation of divine images, all these events demanded royal presence and performance of proper ceremonies. The more temples a pharaoh built, and building temples was expected, the more ceremonies they created for themselves. Offerings required royal oversight. While priests handled daily offerings, major presentations required pharaonic involvement. Bulls, geese, bread, beer, wine, and countless other offerings had to be consecrated and presented with proper ceremony. The scale of temple economies meant that managing these offerings became a massive logistical undertaking. Private royal rituals added to the burden. The pharaoh performed personal devotions, consulted oracles, sought dream interpretations, and conducted various private ceremonies maintaining their magical power. These personal religious practices occurred beyond the public ceremonies, adding yet more ritual obligations to already overflowing schedules. The coordination required to maintain this ceremonial schedule was staggering. Priests, officials, and attendants had to prepare for each ceremony, gather necessary materials, ensure proper conditions, and manage the countless details that allowed rituals to proceed smoothly. The pharaoh stood at the centre of this massive organisational effort, and any failure reflected on them. The physical demands shouldn't be underestimated. Many ceremonies required standing for extended periods, processing long distances while carrying heavy ceremonial objects, performing repetitive ritual gestures, and maintaining perfect composure despite discomfort. Elderly pharaohs or those in poor health particularly struggled with these physical demands. The mental demands were equally challenging. Priests spent years learning the proper words, gestures, and sequences for ceremonies. Pharaohs needed to master these, or at least know them well enough to avoid obvious errors during public performances. The amount of memorization required, prayers, hymns, ritual instructions, was enormous. The timing pressures created constant stress. Many ceremonies had to occur at specific astronomical moments: sunrise, noon, sunset, or particular stellar alignments. Missing these cosmic windows meant postponing ceremonies or performing them improperly, neither option being acceptable. The pharaoh's schedule was dictated by the movements of sun, moon, and stars. Weather created complications. Ceremonies planned for outdoor spaces might face sandstorms, extreme heat, or other challenging conditions. But postponing rituals wasn't simple. It required additional ceremonies to apologise to gods for delays, and to ritually purify the interrupted time. Sometimes proceeding despite bad weather proved easier than dealing with postponement complications. The seasonal agricultural cycle created additional ceremonial demands. Planting seasons, flood predictions, harvest celebrations, and other agriculturally linked rituals all required royal involvement. Since agriculture formed Egypt's economic foundation, these ceremonies carried enormous practical importance beyond their religious significance. Crisis situations demanded special ceremonies. Droughts, plagues, military threats, or other disasters required the pharaoh to perform additional rituals seeking divine intervention. These emergency ceremonies added to the already full ceremonial calendar, creating periods of intense religious activity during the times when pharaohs faced the most stress. The ceremonial obligations never ended. Unlike modern jobs with weekends and vacations, the pharaoh's religious duties continued relentlessly every day of every year for their entire reign. There were no days off from being the intermediary between gods and humanity. The exhaustion of maintaining this schedule over years or decades must have been crushing. Behind the magnificent facade of divine kingship lurked another harsh reality. Pharaohs lived in constant danger from those around them. The throne of Egypt was so valuable, so powerful, that ambitious individuals perpetually schemed to seize it. Every pharaoh navigated a world where trusted advisors might be plotting betrayal and family members could become deadly rivals. The historical record preserves numerous examples of palace conspiracies. The harem conspiracy against Rameses III, documented in surviving trial records, reveals how even a powerful, successful pharaoh faced organised attempts to end his life. Court officials, harem women, and even trusted servants participated in plots to replace him with a rival claimant. The conspiracy's complexity and the high-ranking participants involved demonstrate how dangerous palace life could be. Royal family members posed particular threats. Brothers, uncles, sons, and other male relatives with royal blood had potential claims to the throne. Ambitious princes might not wait patiently for natural succession, especially if they feared being passed over in favour of other heirs. The struggle between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III illustrates how succession conflicts could divide courts and create lasting tensions. Queens and royal mothers wielded significant influence and occasionally pursued their own political agendas. While many queens supported their pharaoh husbands loyally, others worked behind the scenes to advance their sons' claims or to gain power for themselves. The balance between respecting powerful queens and preventing them from becoming threats required constant, careful management. The military presented another source of danger. Successful generals commanded troops' loyalty and possessed the means to overthrow pharaohs. While most generals served faithfully, the temptation of supreme power occasionally proved overwhelming. Pharaohs needed strong militaries to defend Egypt, but couldn't allow generals to become too powerful or too popular with troops. Foreign powers sometimes sponsored conspiracies or supported rival claimants. Egypt's neighbours understood that removing a strong pharaoh and replacing them with a weaker or friendlier ruler served their interests. Foreign gold occasionally funded palace conspiracies, adding international dimensions to domestic threats. The administrative class, scribes, officials, and bureaucrats who managed Egypt's government, possessed knowledge and connections that made them potentially dangerous. A vizier or high official who turned traitor could do enormous damage, disrupting government functions, embezzling resources, or organising attempts to seize power. Pharaohs needed competent administrators, but couldn't fully trust even the most capable ones. Priests, who controlled enormous temple wealth and wielded religious authority, occasionally clashed with pharaohs over resources or policies. While direct priestly rebellions were rare, priests could undermine royal authority through religious interpretations, oracle manipulations, or simply passive resistance to royal directives. Managing the priesthood required balancing respect for religious institutions with maintaining ultimate royal authority. The palace itself, filled with servants, guards, and attendants, created security nightmares. Anyone with access to royal quarters potentially posed threats. Food could be tampered with, guards could be bribed or coerced. Even the most vigilant security arrangements had vulnerabilities that kept pharaohs constantly alert to potential dangers. The lack of modern security measures meant that determined conspirators had realistic chances of success. There were no metal detectors, no security cameras, no background checks. Guards needed constant monitoring. Servants required careful selection and supervision. Even the most vigilant security arrangements had weaknesses. The psychological toll of living under constant threat shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine never fully relaxing, never completely trusting even close companions, always wondering if today might be the day someone strikes. The paranoia this generated could warp personalities and damage relationships. Some pharaohs responded to threats by becoming increasingly isolated, trusting only tiny circles of intimates. This isolation, while potentially increasing safety, created its own problems by cutting pharaohs off from information and making them dependent on small groups who might manipulate them. Others responded with harsh repression, executing suspected conspirators and intimidating potential threats through displays of power. This approach could work temporarily, but generated resentment that fueled future conspiracies. The balance between vigilance and tyranny proved difficult to maintain. The succession crisis that followed weak or unsuccessful reigns demonstrated what happened when royal authority collapsed. Competing claimants might plunge Egypt into civil war, regional governors might declare independence, foreign powers might invade. The stability of the entire nation depended on maintaining royal authority, adding pressure to already stressed rulers. Young pharaohs faced particular vulnerability. Children or teenagers inheriting the throne lacked the experience and established authority to defend against conspiracies effectively. Regents and advisors who controlled young pharaohs might eliminate them once their usefulness ended. The historical record suggests several suspicious deaths of young rulers. Female pharaohs faced additional challenges since their rule violated traditional expectations about masculine kingship. Hatshepsut's successful reign ended mysteriously, and her successor systematically erased her from monuments. Whether she died naturally or was removed remains debated, but the systematic erasure suggests that powerful factions opposed female rule. The elderly pharaohs approaching natural death faced succession crises as various factions positioned themselves for the transition. The period immediately before and after a pharaoh's death became particularly dangerous as rivals jockeyed for position. Many successions involved violence as the new ruler eliminated potential challengers. The need to project strength despite threats created exhausting performance requirements. A pharaoh who showed fear or uncertainty risked emboldening conspirators. Maintaining the appearance of invulnerable divine authority while privately worrying about potential plots required constant vigilance and self-control. The truth is, pharaohs ruled from beautiful palaces that were simultaneously gilded prisons. They wielded enormous power, but couldn't trust those around them. They commanded millions, but lived in constant danger from those closest to them. The loneliness and fear that this created made life at the top profoundly unbearable. The magnificent images of pharaohs in their crowns, jewels, and elaborate costumes look splendid in paintings and sculptures. Actually wearing these items, however, was physically uncomfortable and often genuinely painful. The regalia that symbolized divine authority came at a steep physical cost. The crowns alone were nightmares to wear. The red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, and the combined double crown that symbolized unified Egypt were all heavy, awkwardly balanced, and secured in ways that created pressure points. These weren't simple hats, but substantial ceremonial objects that had to be worn for hours during ceremonies. The weight of crowns concentrated on the head and neck created painful pressure. Try wearing something weighing several pounds on your head for even 30 minutes, and you'll understand the discomfort. Pharaohs wore crowns for hours during ceremonies, developing chronic neck pain and headaches. The pressure points where crowns rested could become tender, or even develop sores from repeated wear. The blue crown, or war crown, while somewhat lighter than the double crown, still created significant discomfort during extended wear. Military campaigns meant potentially wearing this crown in desert heat, while leading armies, a recipe for dehydration, exhaustion, and severe discomfort. The artificial beards attached to royal chins might look distinguished in art, but wearing them was uncomfortable. These ceremonial beards, often made of metal or decorated materials, attached via bands or wires that pressed against the face and pulled on the skin. Wearing these beards for extended ceremonies left marks and caused irritation. The false beard posed particular problems in Egypt's heat. The metal or synthetic materials trapped heat against the face, while the securing bands chafed the skin. Sweating underneath the beard created moisture that could cause irritation if worn repeatedly without proper cleaning. The royal sceptres and staffs that pharaohs carried during ceremonies were heavy and awkward. The crook and flail, the two most iconic royal implements, had to be held in specific positions throughout lengthy ceremonies. Try holding your arms in fixed positions for several hours, and you'll quickly understand the muscle fatigue and cramping this caused. The elaborate collar necklaces, called wesek, were magnificent pieces of jewellery but also heavy. These broad collars, made of gold, semi-precious stones and faience beads, weighed several pounds and rested on the collarbones and shoulders. Extended wear created pressure points that became painful. The collar's weight pulled on the neck and shoulders, creating strain that accumulated over hours of wear. The decorative elements could catch on clothing or dig into the skin if positioned wrong. Removing the collar after extended wear probably revealed reddened, irritated skin underneath. The elaborate belt buckles, ceremonial kilts, and layered garments of state occasions created additional discomfort. Multiple layers of linen, while providing impressive appearance, trapped heat in Egypt's climate. Ceremonial occasions that required full regalia became endurance tests, especially during summer months. The royal sandals, while better than going barefoot on hot stone pavements, were often ceremonial rather than comfortable. Decorated sandals, designed for appearance rather than function, could create blisters and foot pain during long ceremonies requiring processions or standing. the makeup worn by pharaohs added to physical discomfort. The heavy coal eye makeup, green eyeshadow and other cosmetics were applied thickly, and in Egypt's heat could run or smudge, creating mess and requiring constant maintenance. Removing these cosmetics required harsh cleansing that irritated the skin. Some cosmetics contained substances now known to be problematic for long-term health. Modern analysis of mummies reveals that regular exposure through daily application and absorption through skin created health risks that ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand. The skin conditions that developed from wearing makeup daily in hot, dusty conditions couldn't be effectively addressed with ancient medicine. Skin problems plagued pharaohs, but couldn't be openly acknowledged since divine rulers weren't supposed to have such issues. The ceremonial wig worn on formal occasions added yet another layer of discomfort. While wigs protected shaved heads from sun and helped maintain elaborate hairstyles, they were hot, heavy, and itchy. Wearing thick wigs in desert heat during outdoor ceremonies must have been miserably uncomfortable. The Regalia's maintenance requirements created additional burdens. These precious items needed constant cleaning, repair, and proper storage. Damage to regalia during ceremonies could be interpreted as bad omens, creating anxiety about properly maintaining and wearing these items. The combination of heavy crowns, elaborate jewellery, ceremonial garments, makeup, wigs, and held implements meant that fully dressed pharaohs carried substantial weight. Moving gracefully while bearing this load required practice and effort. Maintaining divine dignity despite physical discomfort demanded constant concentration. Elderly pharaohs particularly struggled with heavy regalia. Joint problems, weakened muscles, and reduced stamina made wearing full ceremonial dress increasingly painful. Yet the expectations didn't diminish with age. Old pharaohs still had to perform ceremonies in full regalia regardless of their physical capacity. The alternative to wearing regalia, appearing without proper royal dress, wasn't really an option. The regalia symbolised divine authority and legitimate kingship. Appearing informally except in strictly private context would undermine royal dignity and could be interpreted as dereliction of duty. So pharaohs endured the physical discomfort of their magnificent clothing, jewellery and crowns, maintaining divine appearances while privately suffering the very human consequences of carrying too much weight in too much heat for too many hours. The price of looking godlike was chronic pain, exhaustion, and physical suffering that made even the most splendid occasions ordeals to endure. Perhaps one of the most unbearable aspects of ruling ancient Egypt was the complete loss of privacy that came with the throne. From the moment someone became pharaoh, virtually every moment of their existence occurred under observation, scrutiny, and documentation. The concept of private life simply didn't exist for Egyptian rulers. The royal palace teemed with people whose jobs involved attending to the pharaoh's every need. Servants dressed them, fed them, bathed them, and managed their daily activities. These weren't occasional helpers, but constant presences who witnessed the most intimate aspects of royal life. Even basic daily functions occurred with attendants nearby. The morning routine alone involved dozens of servants. Some specialised in bringing washing water, others in selecting clothing, still others in applying makeup, arranging wigs, or serving breakfast. Each task required specific servants with designated responsibilities. The pharaoh couldn't simply wake up alone and go about their morning. Every step was attended and observed. Eating meals became public performances rather than personal activities. Formal meals especially required elaborate service with numerous attendants serving courses, managing food presentation, pouring drinks, and managing the countless details of a royal dining. Even informal meals involved servants and could never be truly private affairs. The bedroom, one of the few spaces modern people consider absolutely private, offered only limited privacy for pharaohs. Guards stood outside, servants waited nearby to respond to summons, and even intimate moments with spouses occurred in context of producing heirs, a matter of state concern rather than purely personal relationship. The constant presence of scribes meant that virtually everything the pharaoh said or did was documented. Royal announcements, judgments, decisions, and even casual remarks might be recorded, creating a permanent record. The knowledge that words could become official documents encouraged guardedness and prevented spontaneous expression. Portraits and statues froze pharaohs in idealized forms for eternity. While modern people might find this appealing, imagine knowing that representations of yourself often highly stylized and bearing limited resemblance to your actual appearance, would be viewed by millions for thousands of years. The pressure to maintain appropriate dignity affected even how pharaohs relaxed. Entertainment and leisure occurred with audiences. Musicians, dancers, and entertainers performed for the pharaoh. But these performances happened in contexts where courtiers, family members, and attendants observed. The pharaoh couldn't simply enjoy entertainment, but had to display appropriate royal responses to performances. Emotional expression required careful management. Pharaohs couldn't freely express frustration, sadness, fear, or other emotions that subjects might interpret as weakness. The need to maintain divine composure at all times meant suppressing natural emotional responses and performing calm authority regardless of inner feelings. Illness presented particular challenges to privacy expectations. When pharaohs became sick, their condition became a state matter, requiring medical attendance, religious ceremonies, and official concern. Personal suffering couldn't remain private but became public knowledge, affecting everything from court politics to international diplomacy. The inability to travel anonymously or experience life outside the royal bubble created profound isolation. Pharaohs couldn't simply walk through a market to see how ordinary people lived, couldn't chat informally with subjects without the interaction being shaped by divine status, couldn't experience the freedom of anonymity that most people took for granted. Even childhood play, for those who inherited the throne young, occurred under supervision and preparation for future royal duties. Royal children couldn't just be children, but had to train for kingship while being constantly reminded of their future divine status. The loss of carefree childhood affected how pharaohs developed emotionally. The lack of genuine confidence created lonely existences. Could pharaohs trust anyone with their real thoughts and feelings? Ministers had political agendas, family members had succession interests, and servants were socially distant. Finding someone who saw the person rather than the god proved nearly impossible. Letters and documents reveal that some pharaohs developed close relationships with certain advisors or family members, but even these relationships existed within frameworks of divine kingship. True equality in relationships was impossible when one party was considered divine and the other decidedly mortal. The expectation of constant availability meant that pharaohs couldn't simply declare themselves unavailable or take personal time. Crises required immediate royal attention regardless of inconvenience. Officials needed decisions, ceremonies demanded participation, and the government required constant oversight. Personal needs came second to state requirements. The architectural layout of palaces reflected and reinforced this lack of privacy. Royal quarters, while luxurious, connected to public spaces and administrative areas. Guards and servants accessed royal areas constantly. The palace wasn't a private home, but a government complex where the pharaoh lived in the midst of official activity. The ritualization of daily life meant that even routine activities followed prescribed patterns. Waking, bathing, dressing, eating, and sleeping all occurred according to established protocols that dictated proper procedures. The freedom to simply do things differently on a whim didn't exist. The documentation of royal life for posterity meant that pharaohs lived with awareness that their actions would be judged by future generations. Tomb autobiographies and official inscriptions created public narratives about royal reigns. The pressure to live up to historical expectations added another layer of performance to daily existence. The contrast between the appearance of absolute power and the reality of constant constraint created psychological tensions. Pharaohs supposedly could do anything, yet actually could do very little without complex considerations of protocol, precedent, religious requirement, and political consequence. Some pharaohs attempted to create small zones of privacy, personal gardens, private chambers, or occasional retreats. But even these spaces weren't truly private. Security required guards, comfort required servants, and status required appropriate surroundings. Complete solitude remained impossible. The loss of privacy extended beyond physical observation to spiritual surveillance. The gods supposedly watched pharaohs constantly, judging whether they properly fulfilled divine duties. This religious dimension meant that even private moments alone theoretically occurred under divine observation. The inability to escape public identity must have been emotionally exhausting. Modern celebrities who complain about lack of privacy experience a mild version of what pharaohs endured. But celebrities can retire or take breaks from public life. Pharaohs had no such options. They remained divine public figures until death. The simple human need for moments alone with one's thoughts, for freedom to act without observation, for privacy to process emotions or simply relax without performance, all these basic needs went largely unmet for Egyptian rulers. The gilded cage of royalty denied fundamental human requirements for solitude and privacy that make life bearable. Beyond religious duties and ceremonial obligations, pharaohs bore responsibility for actually governing Egypt, managing the complex bureaucracy required to administer a large agricultural state. The administrative burdens of kingship were crushing and never-ending. Ancient Egypt operated as a centralized bureaucratic state, with the pharaoh at the pyramid's apex. Every significant decision, policy change, major appointment, or resource allocation theoretically required royal approval. The sheer volume of administrative matters demanding attention was staggering. The vizier, serving as chief minister, handled much daily administration, but major decisions still required pharaonic authority. The pharaoh needed to review significant cases, approve important policies, and make final determinations on matters the bureaucracy couldn't resolve. This meant endless meetings, document reviews, and decision-making sessions. The justice system required royal involvement at its highest levels. While local officials and courts handled routine cases, important disputes, serious offences, and cases involving high-ranking individuals came to royal attention. The pharaoh, as ultimate source of justice, had to review evidence, hear arguments, and render judgments. Tax collection and resource management formed crucial governmental functions requiring oversight. Egypt's economy depended on systematic taxation of agricultural production. The pharaoh needed to understand harvest yields, set reasonable tax rates, manage state granaries, and ensure fair distribution during lean years. This required processing enormous amounts of economic information. Tomb inscriptions and papyri reveal the complexity of Egypt's administrative systems. Scribes meticulously recorded everything from grain deliveries to worker attendance to quarry outputs. These records ultimately supported royal decision-making, but processing all this information required time and mental energy. Military administration added another layer of responsibility. The pharaoh served as commander-in-chief, making strategic decisions about where to deploy forces, when to campaign, how to respond to border threats, and whom to appoint to military commands. These decisions could determine national survival, and required careful consideration. Foreign relations demanded constant attention. Egypt maintained diplomatic relationships with numerous foreign powers: Hatti, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and various smaller kingdoms. Managing these relationships involved reading diplomatic correspondence, receiving foreign ambassadors, making decisions about treaties and marriages, and projecting Egyptian power effectively. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters reveals the volume and complexity of international relations. Foreign rulers sent numerous letters requesting aid, proposing marriages, demanding explanations for Egyptian actions, or offering diplomatic pleasantries. Each letter required appropriate response reflecting careful consideration of Egypt's interests. Provincial administration required oversight even though nomarchs, provincial governors, handled local matters. The pharaoh needed to appoint reliable governors, prevent provincial officials from becoming too powerful or independent, address complaints about mismanagement or unfairness, and maintain central authority over distant regions. Temple administration represented another massive responsibility. Egypt contained hundreds of temples, each with states, priesthoods, and economic interests. The pharaoh theoretically owned all temple property and appointed high priests. Managing these religious institutions while respecting their authority required diplomatic skill and constant attention. Construction projects, the massive building programs that created Egypt's monumental architecture, required extensive royal involvement. The pharaoh determined what to build, allocated resources for construction, oversaw designs, managed labour forces, and ensured projects proceeded appropriately. A single major temple could require decades of sustained effort and enormous resources. The labour organisation for construction projects alone was staggering. Tens of thousands of workers needed to be fed, housed, supplied with tools, managed efficiently and kept motivated. Modern project management for far smaller undertakings requires sophisticated techniques. Imagine managing comparable projects with ancient tools and communications. Resource allocation decisions determined how Egypt's wealth was distributed among competing priorities: military needs, religious obligations, construction projects, administrative costs, disaster relief, and maintaining royal prestige. These allocation decisions involved difficult calculations where choosing one priority meant reducing others. The papyrus bureaucracy, the endless flow of documents requiring attention, must have been mentally exhausting. Reports from officials, petitions from subjects, legal documents requiring seals, diplomatic communications, religious texts, construction reports. The volume of written material demanding royal attention was immense. Reading and understanding these documents required literacy in specialized bureaucratic language. While scribes could read documents aloud and explain complexities, pharaohs needed sufficient understanding to make informed decisions. The intellectual demands of managing complex information shouldn't be underestimated. The speed at which decisions needed to be made created constant pressure. Crises didn't wait for convenient timing. Military emergencies, diplomatic incidents, natural disasters, and internal problems required immediate attention. The pharaoh needed to be available to address urgent matters regardless of other obligations. The consequences of administrative failures fell squarely on the pharaoh. Poor decisions could lead to military defeats, economic crises, social unrest, or other disasters that damaged royal prestige and endangered Egypt. The weight of knowing that mistakes could harm millions created enormous stress. Balancing competing factions within the government required political skill and constant attention. Military officers, priests, scribal administrators, provincial governors, and courtiers all pursued their interests. Managing these factions, preventing any from becoming too powerful, and maintaining royal authority over all required shrewd political maneuvering. The inability to delegate everything meant that pharaohs carried ultimate responsibility, even when they relied on ministers to handle details. If subordinates made poor decisions or engaged in misconduct, the pharaoh bore the blame. This created incentive for direct involvement even when delegation would have been more efficient. The administrative burden accumulated across reign lengths. A pharaoh who ruled for decades faced tens of thousands of decisions, millions of documents, countless problems solved or managed. The cumulative mental exhaustion of this sustained decision-making must have been profound. Some pharaohs clearly excelled at administration, managing Egypt effectively and leaving records of prosperous reigns. Others struggled with administrative burdens, leaving periods of mismanagement and decline. But even successful rulers worked incredibly hard to maintain effective governance. The contrast between modern governmental structures with specialized agencies, professional civil services, and institutional continuity versus ancient systems depending heavily on personal royal involvement reveals how much harder ancient governance was. Pharaohs couldn't simply hire expert administrators to handle problems. They were the government in very direct ways that made ruling an endless, exhausting responsibility. If the administrative burdens and religious obligations weren't enough, pharaohs also navigated complex family dynamics, where personal relationships intertwined impossibly with politics, succession, and power. Royal families were breeding grounds for jealousy, rivalry, and sometimes deadly conflict. The practice of maintaining multiple royal wives, particularly common among powerful pharaohs, created complicated household dynamics. While officially Egypt's pharaohs had one chief wife, the Great Royal Wife, they often maintained relationships with numerous secondary wives. Managing relationships among co-wives who competed for royal favour and whose children competed for succession created constant tension. The children of various wives had different claims to the throne based on their mother's status. Sons of the Great Royal Wife had strongest claims, but sons of secondary wives might be older, more capable, or better supported politically. These competing claims created succession uncertainties that could explode into open conflict. Hatshepsut's relationship with her stepson Thutmose III exemplifies family succession conflicts. After her husband's death, Hatshepsut served as regent for young Thutmose III, then crowned herself pharaoh and ruled in her own right for about 20 years. After her death, Thutmose III systematically removed her from monuments, suggesting deep resentment over her assumption of power he considered rightfully his. The need to maintain royal bloodlines through strategic marriages created situations where pharaohs married within extended royal families. These marriages, while politically necessary to maintain divine lineage, created unusual family dynamics and, in some cases, genetic problems that affected royal health across generations. Sons waiting for their fathers to die so they could inherit faced decades of potential frustration. A pharaoh who ruled for 40 or 50 years might have middle-aged heirs who spent their entire adult lives preparing for kingship but never actually ruling. This created resentment and occasionally prompted sons to consider accelerating succession through various means. Daughters in royal families served primarily as marriage assets, wed to important nobles, princes, or foreign rulers to cement alliances. Their personal preferences mattered little compared to political calculations. Royal princesses had luxurious lives but limited agency over their own destinies. The harem conspiracies, like the one against Ramesses III, often involved secondary wives whose sons stood little chance of inheriting. These women, seeing their children permanently relegated to subordinate positions, sometimes conspired to eliminate heirs with stronger claims and elevate their own children. The trial documents from Ramesses III's conspiracy reveal how royal women, harem officials, and even military officers collaborated in organised attempts to change succession. The conspiracy's extent shocked even ancient prosecutors, revealing how dangerous royal households could be. Mothers advancing their sons' claims exercised significant influence, and sometimes became powers behind the throne. Queen mothers or regent mothers for young pharaohs wielded authority that could eclipse the pharaohs themselves. This created tensions between biological mothers' ambitions and their sons' desires for independent rule. The elderly pharaohs facing death struggled with succession decisions that would shape Egypt's future. Choosing an heir meant elevating one son and disappointing others, creating potential for post-death conflicts. Not clearly designating an heir invited succession wars. Either choice created problems. Co-regencies, where pharaohs elevated sons to co-rule before death, attempted to ensure smooth succession, but created their own complications. Two pharaohs sharing power needed to coordinate decisions and avoid conflicts. Some co-regencies worked well, others created confusion about who actually ruled. The erasure of previous rulers from monuments, called damnatio memoriae, occurred when successors wanted to deny predecessors legitimacy or eliminate rivals' supporters. Hatshepsut suffered this fate, as did the Amarna period rulers including Akhenaten. This systematic destruction of memory demonstrated the deadly seriousness of royal succession conflicts. Female pharaohs particularly faced succession challenges since their rule violated traditional expectations. Hatshepsut, Sobek-Neferu, and later Cleopatra all ruled successfully, but faced extra obstacles proving legitimacy. Their reigns often occurred during succession crises or dynastic endpoints, when normal male succession couldn't occur. The emotional toll of family conflicts cannot be underestimated. These weren't abstract political rivals, but siblings, parents, children, and spouses. The knowledge that family members might plot against you, or that your own succession decisions might trigger family wars, created unbearable psychological burdens. The need to balance family affection against political necessity forced impossible choices. Should a pharaoh promote the most capable son, or the one with strongest claim? Support a beloved relative, or make the politically necessary choice? These decisions, with no good answers, weighed heavily on pharaohs trying to be both effective rulers and decent family members. The loneliness of not knowing whom to trust extended painfully into family relationships. Could pharaohs confide in siblings who might become rivals? Trust sons who might wish for earlier succession? Rely on spouses who might advance their own children ruthlessly? Family relationships complicated by succession. Politics created isolation within one's own household. The awareness that family dramas would play out publicly added pressure to private relationships. Everything that happened in royal families became state business, subjected to scrutiny and interpretation by courtiers, priests, and the public. Private family matters couldn't remain private when they involved the divine royal family. The splendour of ancient Egyptian medicine, while advanced for its time, couldn't prevent pharaohs from suffering various ailments, injuries, and chronic conditions that made their lives physically uncomfortable. Moreover, the medical knowledge of the period, though impressive in some areas, had severe limitations that left many conditions untreatable. Dental health plagued ancient Egyptians generally and pharaohs particularly. The stone-ground grain that formed their dietary staple contained sand and grit that wore down teeth and created painful dental problems. Royal mummies show severe dental conditions, including cavities and extreme wear that must have caused chronic pain. Unlike modern people with access to dentistry, ancient Egyptians had limited options for dental problems. The constant pain from dental issues affected eating, speaking, and general comfort. Living with chronic toothaches for years without effective relief was simply part of life for many pharaohs. The heavy makeup pharaohs wore daily contained substances that we now know posed health risks. Long-term exposure through daily application and absorption through skin created various health issues that ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand. The cosmetics meant to enhance divine appearance gradually undermined physical well-being. Mummy studies reveal that pharaohs suffered from numerous health conditions. Joint problems, spinal issues, and age-related conditions plagued elderly rulers. The physical demands of wearing heavy regalia, performing lengthy ceremonies, and maintaining rigid postures during formal occasions contributed to chronic pain conditions. Rameses II, who lived into his 90s, suffered severe joint problems and spinal issues that made movement painful. His mummy shows curved spine and joint damage from decades of wear. His final years, while politically successful, were physically difficult as his aging body struggled with accumulated damage. Tutankhamun's mummy reveals multiple health problems including malaria, bone disease, and foot deformities that required canes for walking. His early death at about 19 may have resulted from accumulated health problems compounded by an injury. His short life was marked by physical suffering despite his royal status. Parasitic infections plagued ancient Egyptians, including royalty. Various parasites transmitted through water contact were endemic in Egypt. Even pharaohs weren't immune to parasites that caused chronic discomfort, organ damage, and shortened lifespans. Akhenaten's unusual physical appearance in art, elongated skull, distinctive body shape, prominent features, has prompted speculation about possible medical conditions. Whether these artistic representations reflected actual physical characteristics or symbolic religious imagery remains debated, but if they represented reality, he lived with significant health challenges. The treatments available to ancient Egyptian physicians, while remarkably sophisticated in some ways, often proved ineffective. Medical papyri describe treatments ranging from sensible herbal remedies to unusual preparations that likely provided little benefit. The gap between medical ambition and medical capability meant many conditions remained untreatable. Wounds from battle or accidents could become problematic easily without modern medical knowledge. Even minor injuries risked complications. Pharaohs who personally led military campaigns risked not just battlefield injuries but potentially serious complications from wounds. The embalming process that pharaohs knew awaited them might have created anxiety about death itself. The knowledge that your body would undergo extensive preservation procedures might not have been comforting even for those who believed firmly in the afterlife and saw preservation as necessary for eternal existence. The heat of Egyptian climate created additional health challenges. Dehydration risks were constant, especially during outdoor ceremonies in full regalia. Heat-related illnesses threatened during summer months. The physical stress of functioning in extreme heat while dressed in heavy clothing must have been intense. Age-related decline hit pharaohs as it does everyone, but pharaohs couldn't retire when health failed. They had to continue performing royal duties despite increasing difficulty. The contrast between the vigour required for effective kingship and the reality of aging bodies created challenging situations. Some pharaohs died suddenly, possibly from conditions like heart problems or strokes that ancient medicine couldn't predict or prevent. The uncertainty about one's health and the limited diagnostic capabilities created anxiety about sudden death without proper succession arrangements. Mental health problems, while not recognised in ancient Egyptian medical terms, surely affected some pharaohs. The stress, isolation and trauma of royal life could trigger psychological conditions. Without modern understanding of mental health, these pharaohs suffered without effective help. The shame of showing weakness meant that pharaohs had to hide illnesses and continue performing duties despite physical suffering. A pharaoh couldn't simply announce they felt unwell and cancel ceremonies. Religious obligations and political necessities demanded they continue regardless of personal health. The inability to exercise normally or maintain physical fitness due to ceremonial constraints might have contributed to health problems. Royal life was sedentary despite occasional hunting or military campaigns. The lack of regular physical activity that was common among working people may have worsened health outcomes for pharaohs who spent much time in formal contexts. The simple reality was that being pharaoh didn't protect against the diseases, injuries, and physical decline that affected all ancient people. If anything, the additional stresses of royal life, the physical demands of regalia and ceremonies, and the isolation from normal activity patterns may have made pharaohs' health worse than that of active common people. Egyptian pharaohs were expected to serve as military leaders, personally leading armies into battle to defend Egypt and expand its borders. This military role, while central to concepts of kingship, exposed pharaohs to terrible dangers and created situations where the gap between divine propaganda and battlefield reality became impossible to ignore. The artistic propaganda showing pharaohs single-handedly defeating entire armies, driving chariots over fallen enemies, and radiating invincible martial power bore little resemblance to battlefield reality. Real warfare was chaotic, terrifying, and deadly. Pharaohs who actually fought risked the same dangers as regular soldiers: arrows, spears, injuries, chariot accidents, and death. The Battle of Kadesh, documented extensively in Ramesses II's accounts, reveals how dangerous battles could be even for pharaohs. Ramesses claimed he was trapped by enemy forces and fought his way free through personal valour. While his accounts certainly inflate his heroism, the core truth is that he found himself in genuinely dangerous situations where defeat and death were real possibilities. The psychological stress of leading armies into battle must have been immense. Pharaohs bore responsibility for thousands of soldiers' lives. Poor strategic decisions could result in devastating defeats, military disasters that would haunt their reigns and damage Egypt. The weight of such decisions, made in the confusion of war with incomplete information, created crushing pressure. The fear before battle, a universal human experience, couldn't be openly acknowledged by pharaohs who had to project divine confidence. Imagine facing potential danger while being unable to show natural fear, having to inspire troops through displays of courage while privately terrified. The performance of fearlessness despite terror must have been psychologically exhausting. The long military campaigns, lasting months and taking armies far from Egypt, created additional hardships. Pharaohs on campaign lived in field conditions, faced supply challenges, dealt with weather extremes, and endured the physical rigours of military life. While royal campaign accommodations exceeded soldiers' conditions, they still meant hardship compared to palace comfort. The heat of desert campaigns, often conducted during summer months, created extreme discomfort. The need to wear ceremonial regalia and maintain royal dignity even in field conditions added to already challenging circumstances. Maintaining divine appearance while enduring the same environmental challenges as the army required constant effort. The diplomatic failures that led to warfare represented setbacks for pharaohs. The inability to resolve conflicts peacefully and maintain Egypt's interests through diplomacy alone meant resorting to force. Some pharaohs probably preferred diplomatic solutions, but found themselves forced into military action by circumstances or political pressures. The losses that resulted from battles pharaohs created heavy burdens. Every Egyptian soldier who died represented someone's son, brother, or father. Pharaohs committed to divine responsibility for Egypt's people had to reconcile their military decisions with the deaths that resulted. The prisoners taken during campaigns created moral complexities for pharaohs. Ancient warfare involved capturing enemies for forced labour or elimination, dealing with defeated enemies, deciding fates of prisoners, and managing aftermath of conquest required decisions that weighed on pharaohs' consciences. The possibility of defeat and capture presented nightmares for pharaohs. What would happen if Egypt's divine king fell to enemies? The shame would be unbearable, the political consequences catastrophic, the personal fate potentially terrible. This fear must have haunted pharaohs entering battles where victory wasn't certain. Ramesses II's accounts of Kadesh include moments where victory seemed uncertain. While he ultimately portrayed events as personal triumph, the reality appears to be a close call narrowly avoided. The gap between propaganda and reality reveals how much pressure existed to present victories even from dangerous situations. The injuries pharaohs sustained in battle created problems beyond immediate pain. A pharaoh with visible battle scars might gain respect as warrior, but also showed themselves vulnerable and mortal. The tension between demonstrating martial valour and maintaining appearance of divine invulnerability created impossible contradictions. The aging pharaohs who could no longer personally lead armies faced dilemmas about delegating military command. Generals who led successful campaigns could become dangerously popular, potential threats to royal authority. But pharaohs physically unable to campaign had to risk empowering subordinates. The rebellions and invasions that pharaohs failed to prevent or defeat damaged their reputations and legitimacy. Military failures could be interpreted as indicating divine disfavour or incompetence. The stakes of military leadership extended beyond tactical victories to fundamental questions about royal fitness to rule. The physical injuries from combat, even when not immediately fatal, could cause long-term problems. Without modern medical care, battle wounds often led to chronic pain, limited mobility, or ongoing complications. Pharaohs who survived battles sometimes lived with permanent reminders of their military experiences. The trauma that combat veterans experienced likely affected ancient warriors, including pharaohs. Without modern understanding of combat stress, pharaohs suffering from battle experiences had no framework for understanding their symptoms and no effective support. The psychological wounds of warfare added to physical burdens. The expectation of continued martial success created relentless pressure. Pharaohs couldn't simply fight one victorious campaign and rest on those achievements. Egypt's borders constantly faced threats requiring ongoing military readiness and periodic campaigns. The demands of military leadership never stopped for pharaohs expected to maintain their warrior king image throughout their reigns. Beyond military campaigns, pharaohs navigated complex webs of international diplomacy that demanded constant attention, tactical thinking, and endless patience. The diplomatic responsibilities of ruling Egypt created their own particular brand of exhausting, often frustrating work that never ended. The ancient Near East contained numerous powerful kingdoms and empires, each pursuing their own interests and viewing Egypt as either potential ally, rival, or target. The pharaoh had to manage relationships with Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, various Levantine city-states, Nubian kingdoms, and Libyan groups. Each relationship required different approaches and constant maintenance. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered at Akhenaten's capital, preserve fascinating and exhausting details of ancient international relations. Foreign rulers wrote to Egyptian pharaohs constantly, requesting gold, demanding explanations for Egyptian actions, proposing marriage alliances, complaining about Egyptian vassals, offering gifts, and engaging in elaborate diplomatic protocols. These letters reveal the tedious nature of ancient diplomacy. A single negotiation might require dozens of letters exchanged over months or years. The formal language of diplomatic correspondence, with its flowery phrases and elaborate protocols, meant that even simple messages required careful composition. Every word choice carried significance that could be interpreted or misinterpreted. Reading and responding to diplomatic correspondence consumed enormous time. Each letter required careful analysis to understand what foreign rulers actually wanted beneath the diplomatic language. Scribes could translate and explain, but pharaohs needed to understand content to make informed decisions about responses. The requests for Egyptian gold came constantly from foreign rulers. Everyone knew Egypt possessed enormous gold resources, and foreign kings perpetually requested gold as gifts, aid, or payment. Pharaohs had to balance maintaining diplomatic relationships through generosity against depleting Egypt's wealth, or appearing weak through excessive gift-giving. One Babylonian king complained about the quality of gold items Egypt sent, creating diplomatic friction over what were supposed to be friendship gifts. This complaint shows how even presents could become sources of tension requiring careful management. Marriage diplomacy created particularly complex situations. Foreign rulers proposed marriages between their daughters and the pharaoh, expecting that such marriages would cement alliances. The pharaoh had to decide which proposals to accept, knowing that refusing could damage relationships, but accepting meant adding more wives to already complex royal households. The one-way flow of marriage alliances created tension. Foreign rulers sent daughters to marry Egyptian pharaohs, but Egypt never sent royal princesses to marry foreign kings. This asymmetry proclaimed Egyptian superiority, but generated resentment among foreign powers who viewed it as insulting. When one Babylonian king requested an Egyptian princess in marriage, the pharaoh Amenhotep III responded that no Egyptian king's daughter had ever been given to anyone, essentially stating that Egyptian princesses were too valuable for foreign kings. Such diplomatic responses, while asserting Egyptian prestige, created long-term relationship problems. The management of vassal states created endless complications. Egypt controlled various territories through vassal arrangements, where local rulers swore loyalty and paid tribute in exchange for Egyptian protection and recognition. These vassals constantly feuded with each other, complained about neighbours, requested military assistance, or sought advantage by manipulating relationships. Letters from Canaanite rulers reveal the constant stream of complaints and requests pharaohs received. One ruler would write claiming his neighbour had attacked him and demanding Egyptian intervention. The neighbour would write with completely different account. The pharaoh had to sort conflicting stories and decide whether and how to intervene. Ignoring vassal complaints risked losing control over territories, but responding to every dispute meant becoming entangled in endless local conflicts. Finding the balance between maintaining authority and avoiding overextension required constant diplomatic skill and often meant choosing between bad options. Intelligence gathering added layers of complication. Pharaohs needed to understand what foreign powers were actually doing beyond what diplomatic correspondence revealed. Informants provided intelligence, but evaluating reliability and sorting truth from rumour required constant effort. The negotiations over territory and influence could drag on for years. The famous Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty required years of negotiation before both sides agreed to terms. The diplomatic effort to achieve peace proved almost as exhausting as the military campaigns that preceded it. The protocol requirements of ancient diplomacy created endless opportunities for giving or taking offence. The order in which rulers were mentioned in letters, the titles used, the quality of gifts exchanged, the treatment of ambassadors, all these details mattered enormously. A perceived slight could damage relationships, making pharaohs constantly vigilant about diplomatic details. The reception of foreign ambassadors required elaborate ceremonies and careful attention to status. Ambassadors expected to be received with appropriate dignity, housed comfortably, given gifts, and treated in ways reflecting their ruler's importance. Managing these visits while extracting useful information and advancing Egyptian interests required diplomatic skill. Language barriers complicated diplomacy since communications required translation. Egyptian scribes trained in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, facilitated correspondence. But translation always risks misunderstanding, and subtle meanings could be lost, creating unintended problems. The expectations that pharaohs would respond personally to important foreign correspondence meant they couldn't simply delegate diplomatic relations entirely. While scribes and officials handled routine matters, significant communications required royal attention and responses carrying pharaonic authority. The pressure to maintain Egypt's prestige and never appear weak in diplomatic contexts constrained options. Pharaohs couldn't simply make pragmatic compromises that would be interpreted as Egyptian weakness. The constant performance of strength limited diplomatic flexibility. Dynasty changes in foreign kingdoms created complications as new rulers sought to establish relationships or challenged existing arrangements. Each time a foreign throne changed hands, Egyptian diplomacy had to adapt to new personalities and potentially changed foreign policies. Trade negotiations accompanied diplomatic relationships, requiring attention to commercial details alongside political considerations. Egypt imported timber from Phoenicia, luxury goods from various sources, and maintained trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. These commercial relationships intertwined with diplomatic relations in complex ways. The gift exchanges that cemented diplomatic relationships represented significant economic commitments. Foreign rulers expected generous gifts from Egypt, and pharaohs needed to respond to gifts received appropriately. The scale of these exchanges involved substantial wealth and required careful tracking. The military threats that diplomacy aimed to prevent created underlying tension in all international relationships. Diplomacy occurred against backdrop of potential warfare. Every negotiation involved implicit calculations about relative military strength and willingness to use force. The alliance shifts in the ancient Near East meant yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's rival. The complex web of relationships among multiple powers created situations where Egypt's friends fought each other, or where potential enemies formed alliances against Egyptian interests. Navigating this shifting landscape required constant attention. Succession crises in foreign kingdoms sometimes drew Egypt into internal foreign politics. Rival claimants to foreign thrones might seek Egyptian support. Deciding whether to intervene involved weighing potential benefits against risks of backing the wrong side. The insults and provocations that occasionally disrupted diplomatic relations required responses balancing honour with pragmatism. When foreign rulers sent insulting messages or took actions Egypt considered provocative, pharaohs had to respond firmly enough to maintain respect, but not so aggressively as to trigger wars over relatively minor matters. The fatigue from decades of diplomatic correspondence, negotiations and relationship management must have been profound for long-reigning pharaohs. Rameses II, ruling for 66 years, engaged in diplomatic relations longer than most modern careers. The accumulated weight of diplomatic responsibilities across such lengthy reigns was truly staggering, and added yet another unbearable dimension to royal life. Egypt's climate, while supporting the agricultural civilization that funded pharaonic power, also created daily physical discomfort that made royal life harder than the magnificent art suggests. Living in ancient Egypt meant dealing with environmental challenges that wealth and power could only partially reduce. The heat was relentless, particularly during summer months when temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, in the shade. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert kingdom, creating conditions where simply existing outside required constant hydration and protection. For pharaohs required to perform outdoor ceremonies in full regalia during these months, the heat became a genuine ordeal. The heavy crowns, elaborate collars, and multiple layers of ceremonial clothing trapped heat against the body. The metal components of regalia absorbed and radiated additional heat. The wigs and false beards added insulation exactly where it wasn't wanted. Pharaohs performing lengthy outdoor ceremonies during summer essentially endured slow roasting while maintaining divine composure. Dehydration posed constant risks in Egypt's climate. The human body loses water rapidly in extreme heat, and inadequate hydration could lead to serious illness. Pharaohs needed to drink frequently, but doing so during ceremonies might appear undignified or interrupt ritual sequences. The balance between maintaining protocol and maintaining health created difficult choices. The sun exposure that came with outdoor ceremonies and activities posed health risks ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand. Prolonged sun exposure damaged skin and contributed to premature aging. Pharaohs who spent decades performing outdoor ceremonies likely experienced these consequences without understanding their cause. The glare from sun reflecting off limestone buildings, monuments, and the desert sand created eye strain and could damage vision over time. Ancient Egyptians had no eye protection from intense glare. Hours of squinting in bright sunlight during ceremonies must have caused headaches, and contributed to vision problems over time. The sandstorms that periodically swept through Egypt created miserable conditions. Fine sand penetrated everywhere, into clothing, hair, eyes, mouths, and buildings. During sandstorms, visibility dropped dramatically, breathing became difficult, and any outdoor activity became nearly impossible. These storms could last for days, disrupting royal schedules and making life uncomfortable. The dust and sand that permeated Egyptian air even without full storms created respiratory irritation. Breathing air containing fine particles irritated lungs and airways. Long-term exposure contributed to chronic respiratory conditions that affected even pharaohs in their magnificent palaces. The insects that thrived in Egypt's climate created constant annoyance. Flies, mosquitoes, and various other insects bred prolifically, particularly near the Nile and during flood season. These insects spread diseases, created bites and irritation, and generally made life less comfortable. Wealth could buy some protection through servants wielding fans, but complete relief was impossible. Mosquitoes transmitted malaria, which studies suggest was endemic in ancient Egypt. Even pharaohs contracted malaria, as analysis of Tutankhamun's remains confirms. The recurring fevers, chills, and exhaustion of malaria made those infected miserable. Living in malaria-endemic regions meant constant exposure risk. The Nile's flooding, while essential to Egyptian agriculture, created its own problems. During flood season, much of the valley became waterlogged. humidity increased dramatically, creating sticky, uncomfortable conditions. Mold and mildew grew in damp environments. The standing water after floods receded became breeding grounds for insects and waterborne illnesses. The crocodiles and hippopotamuses that inhabited the Nile posed genuine dangers. These large, aggressive animals were responsible for deaths regularly. Pharaohs who engaged in river activities for ceremonial purposes, recreation, or travel faced real risks from these animals. The Nile's bounty came with dangers that even divine status couldn't eliminate. The temperature swings between day and night in desert climate created additional discomfort. Days might be scorching hot, but nights could become surprisingly cold, particularly during winter months. The need to adjust to these temperature variations affected comfort and made finding appropriate clothing challenging. The dryness of Egypt's climate, while better than humidity for preservation, created its own problems. Dry air irritated respiratory passages, dried out skin, and caused various discomforts. The constant battle against dehydration affected everyone, and wealth couldn't completely eliminate the challenges of living in an arid environment. The limited vegetation outside the narrow Nile Valley meant that shade was precious and rare. The desert surrounding the valley offered no relief from sun. Even within the cultivated areas, trees were relatively sparse. Finding comfortable outdoor spaces required careful planning around available shade. The agricultural cycle that governed Egyptian life meant that certain seasons brought particular challenges. Harvest time meant maximum activity when heat was also at peak levels. The planting season following floods meant working in muddy, insect-infested conditions. The seasons dictated work patterns that couldn't simply be avoided for comfort. The lack of modern climate control meant that living spaces heated up during the day and cooled at night following ambient temperatures. Thick-walled buildings provided some insulation, and architectural features like wind catches helped with cooling. But Egyptian buildings were still hot during summer and could be uncomfortable during winter. The ceremonial requirement to appear perfect and composed despite environmental discomfort added psychological stress to physical challenges. Pharaohs couldn't openly complain about heat, wipe away sweat during ceremonies, or show discomfort. Maintaining divine dignity while privately suffering from heat, insects, and other environmental challenges required constant self-control. The water quality issues that affected ancient Egypt created health risks. The Nile, while providing irrigation and drinking water, also carried various organisms and substances. Certain waterborne illnesses infected substantial portions of the population, including royalty. The cycle of exposure made chronic problems difficult to avoid. The limitation on escaping environmental challenges made them more unbearable. Modern people can travel to more comfortable climates, use climate control, or take breaks from uncomfortable conditions. Pharaohs were tied to Egypt by duty and couldn't simply leave when conditions became unpleasant. They endured environmental challenges year after year with minimal relief, making what might be temporary discomfort for others into permanent features of their existence. The magnificent monuments that define ancient Egypt, pyramids, temples, obelisks, and colossal statues, stand as testaments to pharaonic power and ambition. But creating these monuments placed enormous pressures on the pharaohs who commissioned them, consuming vast resources, demanding constant attention, and creating expectations that were often difficult to fulfill. The expectation that pharaohs would build monuments to glorify gods and ensure their own eternal memory created immediate pressure from the moment of coronation. A pharaoh who failed to build would be seen as weak, lacking in piety, or ineffective. Building was mandatory, not optional, regardless of economic circumstances or other priorities. The scale of projects pharaohs undertook was staggering. A single major temple could require decades of sustained effort, employ thousands of workers, consume enormous quantities of stone and other materials, and cost the equivalent of modern billions. Multiplying this across the multiple projects most pharaohs pursued reveals the magnitude of resource commitment involved. The competition with predecessor pharaohs created pressure to build bigger, more impressive monuments. Each generation of rulers tried to match or surpass their predecessors' achievements, leading to ever larger and more ambitious projects. This architectural competition within Egypt meant that adequate was never enough. Pharaohs needed to achieve impressive to meet expectations. The religious obligation to maintain existing temples and build new ones created financial burdens that competed with other state needs. Temple construction and maintenance consumed substantial portions of Egypt's economic output. The resources devoted to religious architecture couldn't be used for military equipment, administrative infrastructure, or disaster relief. The workforce requirements for major construction projects created organisational nightmares. Tens of thousands of workers needed to be recruited, fed, housed, supplied with tools, supervised, and managed. Organising these massive labour forces required sophisticated administrative capabilities and constant oversight to prevent waste and inefficiency. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built by Khufu, required an estimated workforce of many thousands, working for about 20 years. Feeding this workforce alone was a massive logistical undertaking requiring grain from across Egypt. The administrative effort required to organise and sustain such projects was itself exhausting. The technical challenges of moving and placing enormous stone blocks tested engineering capabilities. Obelisks weighing hundreds of tons had to be quarried, transported hundreds of miles and erected precisely. Any failure during these operations would be public embarrassment, potentially interpreted as indicating divine disfavour or incompetence. The quarrying of stone required sending expeditions to distant quarries in the desert or Nubia. These expeditions involved organising supplies, protecting workers, managing quarry operations and transporting stone back to building sites. The pharaoh bore ultimate responsibility for these expeditions' success. The dangers inherent in construction projects caused injuries and deaths for which pharaohs bore moral responsibility. Moving massive stones with ancient technology was dangerous work. Ropes could break, stones could fall, scaffolding could collapse. Each worker harmed represented someone's family member whose injury resulted from royal building ambitions. The quality control required to ensure monuments were built correctly demanded constant inspection and oversight. Architects, overseers, and ultimately pharaohs needed to verify that projects proceeded according to plans and specifications. Discovering problems after construction was far advanced, created expensive corrections and delays. The decoration of monuments, the relief carvings, paintings and inscriptions covering temple walls, required skilled artisans working for years. The pharaoh had to approve designs, review completed work, and ensure that iconography correctly represented religious and political messages. The artistic decision-making involved was substantial and time-consuming. The inscriptions on monuments required careful composition. These texts, visible to all who visited temples, had to properly honour gods, celebrate royal achievements, and create appropriate historical records. The pressure to present ideal image through monumental inscriptions meant creating effective propaganda required thought and effort. The costs of monument building created tension with other state expenditures. Resources spent on temples couldn't be spent on military campaigns, infrastructure maintenance, or economic development. Pharaohs had to balance competing priorities, and the choice to build monumentally meant accepting that other needs would receive less attention. The economic burden of supporting priestly classes in temples pharaohs built added ongoing costs beyond initial construction. Each new temple required endowments to fund operations, pay priests, and support religious activities. These endowments removed resources from royal control permanently, creating long-term economic commitments. The possibility that monuments would be claimed by successor pharaohs created anxiety about legacy. Many pharaohs had their names removed from monuments and replaced with successors' names, a practice that undermined the entire purpose of building for eternal memory. The knowledge that future pharaohs might claim credit for one's achievements added frustration to the already substantial burden of building. The unfinished monuments that resulted when pharaohs died before completing projects represented visible failures that tarnished reputations. Temples left incomplete, obelisks abandoned in quarries, and decoration programs unfinished all testified to ambitions that exceeded available time. The pressure to complete projects before death created constant urgency. The natural disasters that could damage monuments represented years of work destroyed. Earthquakes damaged structures, floods undermined foundations, and normal wear required maintenance. Pharaohs had to devote resources to maintaining monuments built by predecessors, alongside their own new construction, multiplying the burden. The stones reused from earlier monuments to build new ones showed that when new pharaohs wanted to build but lacked fresh resources, they sometimes cannibalized existing structures. This recycling undermined the eternal nature supposedly ensured by monumental construction, revealing the challenges of sustaining ambitious building programs. The comparison between monumental achievement and actual governance created tension. Pharaohs who built magnificent monuments while allowing Egypt's military power to decline or economic conditions to deteriorate showed potentially misplaced priorities. The emphasis on building could distract from more pressing governmental responsibilities. The knowledge that future generations would judge pharaohs largely based on architectural achievements created pressure to build impressive monuments, even at cost of other priorities. The historical legacy depended substantially on visible stone monuments, rather than the harder-to-document achievements of good governance, making building an unavoidable obsession for pharaohs concerned with their eternal reputation. Beyond the loss of privacy discussed earlier, pharaohs experienced a profound existential isolation, resulting from their sacred status that went deeper than simply being watched constantly. The very nature of divine kingship created an unbridgeable gap between pharaohs and all other humans that made genuine connection nearly impossible. The moment someone became pharaoh, everyone's relationship with them fundamentally changed. Childhood friends who once played together now had to approach with ritual respect. Siblings who once quarrelled became formal courtiers. Parents who once guided them now venerated them as divine. The continuity of personal relationships shattered when the crown appeared. The protocols of approaching royalty created physical and social distance. Common people prostrated themselves before pharaohs. Even high officials bowed deeply and used elaborate formulas of address. This constant submission from everyone reinforced pharaohs' separation from ordinary humanity. The inability to have normal conversations created frustrating isolation. Every exchange with subjects was shaped by the power differential and divine status. People told pharaohs what they wanted to hear, rather than uncomfortable truths. Honest criticism or genuine disagreement rarely reached royal ears, because courtiers feared punishment for perceived disrespect. The flattery that surrounded pharaohs meant drowning in praise. Every action was praised, every decision acclaimed, every word treated as wisdom. This constant praise, while superficially pleasant, prevented pharaohs from receiving honest feedback necessary for learning, growing, or understanding reality accurately. The inability to gauge genuine loyalty versus self-interested compliance created constant uncertainty about relationships. Did officials support royal policies because they thought them wise, or because disagreeing was dangerous? Did family members express affection genuinely, or from hope of advancement? The ambiguity poisoned relationships with suspicion. The performance of divinity required suppressing human emotions and reactions that might reveal mortality. Pharaohs couldn't cry openly when grief-stricken, couldn't laugh unreservedly at humour, couldn't show anger that might appear undignified. The emotional suppression required to maintain divine image was psychologically exhausting. The lack of peers meant pharaohs had no equals with whom they could relate as one human to another. Everyone was either above them, the gods, or below them, all humans. The absence of peer relationships, which provide crucial social and emotional support throughout human development, created developmental challenges. The inability to share burdens or seek comfort from others made challenges harder to bear. Most people facing difficulties can share problems with friends or family who offer support and perspective. Pharaohs who shared doubts or fears risked appearing weak and undermining their authority. They carried burdens alone. The knowledge that their every action would be recorded and judged by future generations created self-consciousness that prevented spontaneity. Pharaohs couldn't simply live in the moment, but had to constantly consider how present actions would be interpreted historically. This historical self-awareness was a burden most humans never experience. The religious isolation that came from being simultaneously human and divine created confusion. Pharaohs had to somehow understand themselves as gods while experiencing completely human bodies and emotions. Reconciling divine status with human reality created contradictions that must have been psychologically disturbing. The mortality that pharaohs knew awaited them despite divine status created existential anxiety. Gods were supposed to be immortal, yet pharaohs aged, sickened, and died like other humans. The approach of death exposed the limitations of divinity in ways that must have been psychologically troubling. The preparation for death and the afterlife that consumed final years reinforced isolation. As pharaohs aged, increasing resources went toward tomb construction and preparations. This focus on death while still living created atmosphere that separated aging pharaohs from the living world around them. The successor, pharaohs in waiting, created additional isolation. Adult heirs waiting to inherit might view reigning pharaohs as obstacles to their own ambitions. The tension between parental bonds and succession realities created twisted emotional dynamics. The inability to retire or step away from divine responsibilities meant that pharaohs never experienced the release from duty that comes with ordinary retirement. They remained divine until death, trapped in their roles without possibility of liberation. The permanence of divine status was itself a form of imprisonment. The language used to address pharaohs reinforced separation from humanity. The elaborate titles, divine epithets, and formal modes of address created linguistic barriers that marked pharaohs as fundamentally different. Even simple exchanges became ritual performances rather than normal human communication. The spaces pharaohs inhabited were designed to emphasize divine status and separation. Thrones elevated above others, enclosed spaces that isolated royalty from subjects, processional ways that kept crowds at distance. All architectural choices reinforced unbridgeable gaps between pharaohs and other people. The artistic representations showing pharaohs at superhuman scale, performing impossible feats, and appearing eternally young and perfect, created public images that bore little resemblance to reality. The disconnect between artistic propaganda and lived reality must have been psychologically challenging. The forbidden topics that couldn't be discussed with pharaohs created information barriers. Courtiers wouldn't mention subjects that might anger or upset divine rulers. This created blind spots where pharaohs remained ignorant of important information, because everyone around them censored communications. The assumption that pharaohs understood everything and needed no instruction meant that learning became difficult. Asking questions might reveal ignorance inappropriate for divine rulers. The inability to freely admit not knowing and ask for explanation prevented intellectual growth and understanding. The emotional labour of maintaining divine performance every waking moment created exhaustion that had no relief. Unlike actors who eventually leave stage, pharaohs performed continuously without breaks from divine character. The accumulated psychological cost of never being able to simply be human was crushing and unbearable. The loneliness that resulted from all these factors, lack of peers, inability to connect authentically, constant performance requirements, and unbridgeable separation from all other humans made pharaonic existence profoundly isolated despite being constantly surrounded by people. It truly was lonely at the top in ways that made the position almost unbearable for anyone with normal human needs for connection and authenticity. As this comprehensive exploration of why living as an Egyptian ruler was unbearable concludes, the full weight of pharaonic existence becomes clear. These were positions of unparalleled power and prestige, but they came with costs that would make most people grateful for their ordinary lives. Every dimension of pharaonic life contained unbearable elements. The divine status that elevated them above humanity simultaneously denied their basic human needs. The religious obligations consumed enormous time and energy. The political dangers made trust impossible. The physical discomfort of regalia and cosmetics created chronic pain. The complete loss of privacy prevented authentic relationships. The administrative burdens demanded constant decision-making. The family conflicts poisoned personal relationships. The health problems received inadequate treatment by modern standards. The military expectations exposed them to danger. The diplomatic responsibilities never ended. The climate created constant discomfort. The monument building demanded vast resources. The isolation prevented genuine human connection. Understanding these unbearable aspects doesn't diminish pharaohs' historical achievements, but rather makes them more impressive. That they accomplished what they did despite such tremendous personal costs testifies to their dedication and strength. The monuments they left, the victories they won, and the prosperity they created came at prices that included their own well-being and happiness. The pharaohs who ruled Egypt successfully did so, not because their position made it easy, but despite the position making it extraordinarily difficult. Their resilience in the face of unbearable pressures reveals human capacity for endurance even under extreme circumstances. For modern readers, understanding why being pharaoh was unbearable provides perspective on how power and privilege often hide suffering invisible to outside observers. The positions that appear most enviable from outside often prove most difficult for those who actually occupy them. The next time you see magnificent images of Egyptian pharaohs or visit museums displaying royal artifacts, remember that behind the golden masks and divine titles stood real people carrying impossible burdens. Their lives of apparent splendour mask daily realities that most of us would find genuinely unbearable. The isolation, the constant performance, the crushing responsibilities, the physical discomfort, the political dangers, the family conflicts, the health challenges, and the endless ceremonial obligations combined to create existences that were, quite literally, unbearable for ordinary humans. That pharaohs bore these burdens anyway, maintaining divine appearances while privately suffering very human struggles, makes their achievements all the more remarkable. Thank you for joining this detailed exploration of the hidden difficulties of ancient Egyptian kingship. May this understanding provide perspective on how appearances can deceive, and how even the most powerful positions come with costs that can make them unbearable, despite their outward glamour. The lesson remains relevant today. Great power and great privilege often come with great suffering that those outside the golden cage can never fully appreciate. Until next time, rest well.